A wealthy businessman makes an unusual deal with a homeless woman, offering her a life-changing sum to carry his child. But when the baby is born, what he sees leaves him utterly stunned. Henry Lawson was a 42-year-old man who had everything: wealth, power, and influence. Yet despite all his success, one thing eluded him: an heir. He longed for a child, not for love or companionship, but as a legacy. Someone to inherit everything he had built. Henry had tried the traditional route before. 2 failed marriages had convinced him that love was nothing more than a troublesome illusion. But a child? That was different. It was a practical investment, a calculated decision. He wanted complete control, no messy emotions, no complicated relationships, just a contract. With his resources, finding someone willing to carry the pregnancy without attachments wouldn't be difficult. The next morning, Henry drove through the city streets, his mind fixed on his goal. As he waited at a stoplight near downtown, something unusual caught his eye. On the sidewalk, a young woman sat hunched over a tattered sheet of paper, sketching. Her tangled brown hair partly hid her face, but her striking blue eyes still shone despite her weary appearance. She seemed invisible to the world around her, yet something about her made Henry pause. He tried to ignore the feeling and drove off when the light changed. But a few blocks later, he pulled into a parking lot, gripping the steering wheel, lost in thought. The idea forming in his mind seemed ridiculous, yet he couldn't shake it. Frustrated, he turned his car around and drove back. She was still there, lost in her drawings, pressing the paper against the wall. Henry pulled up to the curb, rolled down his window, and called out, his voice sharp and commanding. "Hey you! Come here!" The woman looked up warily, her eyes narrowing as she studied the well-dressed man in the luxury car. She hesitated. "I'm not asking. Get over here. I don't have all day," he added impatiently. Slowly, reluctantly, she approached. Up close, the signs of struggle were even more evident. Her thin frame, her worn clothes. But there was something in her stance, a quiet resilience. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice cautious but firm. Henry assessed her for a moment before replying. "Get in. We need to talk." She let out a dry laugh. "If you're looking for that kind of company, you've got the wrong person." He frowned, clearly irritated. "Don't be ridiculous. I have no interest in that. I have a proposition for you. Now get in the car, or stay here and keep scraping by on the streets. Your choice." She hesitated, but his authoritative tone left little room for argument. With a quiet sigh, she opened the door and got in. The car ride was silent. Henry, unfazed, drove to a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. As they settled at a secluded table, he leaned forward. "What's your name?" he asked. "Leah Parker." "But why does that matter?" she shot back, her expression guarded. "Because I need to know who I'm dealing with," he said, smoothly. "Tell me, Leah, why do you sit on the sidewalk, drawing like the rest of the world doesn't exist?" She shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "What else is there to do? I lost everything, but that's none of your business." Henry tapped his fingers against the table. "Fair enough. I'll get straight to the point. I have an offer that could change your life." She eyed him suspiciously. "What kind of offer?" "I want you to have a child for me." Leah blinked. "You're joking." "I don't joke about business. This is a serious proposition. I'll take care of all your expenses, provide everything you need during the pregnancy. And at the end, you'll receive a sum that will ensure you never have to worry about money again." She let out a nervous laugh, crossing her arms. "This is insane. What kind of man makes an offer like that to a total stranger?" "The kind who knows exactly what he wants and doesn't waste time," Henry said, without hesitation. "I don't want a relationship, Leah. No emotional complications, just a child. Simple as that." She stared at him, stunned. His words echoed in her mind. "I want you to have my child." Every instinct told her to walk away, but deep down, she knew. He was serious. His cold, calculated logic left her torn between pride and the brutal reality of her life. "This is madness," she whispered. "No woman in her right mind would agree to something like this." Henry didn't flinch. His expression remained unreadable. "No woman in your position would refuse." His words were sharp, direct. "I'm offering you a way out. Security, stability, a fresh start. In exchange, all I need is something you already have, the ability to bear a child." Leah crossed her arms, trying to maintain her resistance, but deep inside, she knew he was right. Every day was a struggle. Every night, a battle to find shelter and warmth. Yet, the idea of giving up something so personal, bringing a life into the world as part of a business deal, made her stomach twist. "And what happens after the baby is born?" she finally asked, her voice filled with doubt. Henry leaned back slightly, as if expecting the question. "Once the child is born," he said, his tone unwavering, "you'll receive a substantial payment. Enough to start over, to live comfortably, to never worry about survival again." Leah inhaled sharply. The weight of his offer settled over her like a storm cloud. She had spent so long scraping by, barely holding on. And now, here was a man offering her a way out, a way to rewrite her life. But at what cost? No strings attached. "You'll be free to live your life, however you choose." Leah let out a dry, humorless laugh. "And how do I know you won't change your mind and drag me into some legal battle later?" Henry studied her for a moment before responding, his tone calm but firm. "Leah, I'm a businessman. I don't make deals unless they're airtight. Everything will be in writing, a legally binding contract. Neither of us will be able to alter the terms once it's signed. Now, let's have a little fun for those who only skim the comments. Type milkshake down below. Only those who've read this far will understand. Back to the story." Leah sat in silence, absorbing his words. The promise of security, even if only temporary, was tempting. She had nothing, not even a place to sleep that night. But this was a life-altering decision, and she knew it. "And if I say no?" she asked, leaning forward slightly, testing him. Henry gave a faint, knowing smile. "Then you go back to the streets. You keep struggling to survive, braving the cold, hunger, and uncertainty. The choice is yours." His words hit like a punch. She wanted to be angry at him for being so blunt, but what angered her more was the truth in what he said. He had backed her into a corner, and they both knew it. Still, there was one thing she needed to understand. "Why?" she demanded. "Why are you doing this? A man like you, with all your money, why not just adopt? Or find one of those rich women who love showing off their perfect kids?" Henry exhaled slowly, his expression hardening. "Because I want a child of my own. My blood, my legacy. Adopting or getting involved with someone in my social circle brings complications I'm not interested in dealing with. I want control, Leah. Nothing more, nothing less." The coldness in his voice made her uneasy. He wasn't hiding anything, and that honesty made her feel even more vulnerable. She swallowed hard. "I need time to think," she said finally, trying to reclaim some sense of control. Henry gave a short nod, as if he had expected her response. "You have 24 hours. After that, don't bother reaching out." Without another word, he stood and walked toward the door. Leah watched him disappear, feeling like she was being pulled into something she might never escape. Wandering the streets, her thoughts raced. Henry's words echoed in her mind: security, stability, a fresh start. She knew what it meant to have nothing. The biting wind reminded her that tomorrow would be another fight for food, another day of being ignored by the world. She sat on a park bench, staring up at the overcast sky. Her mother used to say that opportunities knock only once, and it's up to you to decide whether to take them. But at what cost? Having a child, even under a contract, was no small decision. But what if this was her only way out? Meanwhile, Henry sat in his high-rise penthouse, reviewing the contract his lawyers had drafted. He hated waiting, but he knew Leah's options were limited. If she declined, he'd move on. It was as simple as that. The intercom buzzed, breaking his thoughts. He answered, his assistant's voice coming through. "Sir, Leah Parker is here." Henry's expression remained unreadable. "Send her up." Minutes later, the door opened. Leah stepped inside, looking exhausted but resolute. "I accept," she said bluntly, before he could say a word. Henry stood, studying her. There was no hesitation in her eyes, just determination. "Good," he said. "Let's make it official." He gestured for her to sit as he picked up the contract. Leah scanned the document carefully. The terms were clear. She would be provided for throughout the pregnancy, all expenses covered, and at the end, she would receive a significant amount to rebuild her life. In exchange, she would relinquish any parental rights. "This is final," she murmured, her fingers grazing the paper. "That's the point," Henry replied. "I hope you're sure." Leah took a deep breath. After a moment of hesitation, she picked up the pen. With a swift motion, she signed her name, sealing the deal that would change both of their lives forever. That same day, Henry's assistant Stephanie escorted Leah to a sleek black car waiting outside the building. As the car pulled away, Leah gazed out the window. The city, which had once felt overwhelming, now seemed different, like a place that might finally offer her something more than just survival. She didn't say much during the ride to Henry's estate, but Stephanie attempted to break the silence. "You'll like the place," she said, with a small smile. "It's quiet, spacious, and most importantly..." The warmth in Stephanie's voice was a stark contrast to the cold reality of the contract Leah had just signed. She simply nodded, still trying to process everything that had happened in the past few hours. When the car finally pulled up to the estate, Leah's eyes widened. The massive iron gates slowly opened, revealing a sprawling property surrounded by meticulously maintained gardens. At the center stood the mansion, a towering structure of marble and glass, as imposing and calculated as the man who owned it. Stephanie led her inside, and Leah barely had time to take in the grandeur. Crystal chandeliers gleamed overhead. A sweeping marble staircase curved elegantly upward, and designer furniture looked as if it had been lifted straight from the pages of a luxury magazine. She felt out of place. "This will be your new home for now," Stephanie said with a smile. "I'll show you to your room. It's one of the best suites in the house." Leah followed silently, still absorbing the unfamiliar surroundings. The suite was beyond anything she had ever imagined. A massive bed with plush linen sheets, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the estate, and a bathroom larger than any apartment she had ever lived in. "If you need anything, just call me. We're here to take care of you," Stephanie added before leaving her alone. Leah sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers across the soft fabric. Just yesterday, she had been sleeping on the cold pavement, and now she was surrounded by nothing but comfort and excess. Yet, despite the luxury, a heavy feeling lingered in the air. She wasn't a guest here. She was part of a transaction. In the days that followed, Leah tried to adjust to her new reality. Meals were served promptly, and a team of doctors had been arranged to conduct preliminary medical examinations. As expected, Henry remained distant. His focus was on work, rarely making an appearance except to review updates from Stephanie about Leah's condition. One of those rare times, they happened to cross paths in the hallway. Leah was just leaving a medical appointment when she saw him approaching, his posture upright, his expression unreadable. "Are you doing okay?" he asked, his tone more like a formality than genuine concern. Leah hesitated before responding. "Everything is going as expected, I guess." He nodded, offering no further conversation. But just as he turned to leave, he paused. "If you need anything, Ask Stephanie. I want you to be well." She wasn't sure what to make of his words. Was it sincerity or just a way to ensure the agreement stayed on track? Either way, that brief interaction lingered in her mind. Even though she was being treated like royalty, Leah couldn't ignore the growing unease inside her. One night, unable to sleep, she stepped onto the balcony of her room, gazing out at the vast gardens bathed in moonlight. Everything was so still, so peaceful, so far removed from the life she had known. Am I making the right choice? She hugged herself against the chilly breeze. The idea of carrying a child and then walking away from it suddenly felt more complicated than she had imagined. The contract was clear. She would have no rights to the child. But how could she possibly prepare for the emotional toll? From a distance, Henry observed her. He had chosen Leah because she was tough, pragmatic. But he also saw something else, a quiet resilience beneath the surface. Despite his calculated nature, he felt a strange curiosity about her. Who was this woman who had accepted such an unusual arrangement? And why couldn't he completely shake the feeling that she was becoming more than just a part of his plan? One evening, Leah was in the living room, absent-mindedly flipping through a book from the Grand Library. She had never been one for classic literature, but there was something soothing about the quiet of the house and the scent of old books. She didn't expect to see Henry walk in. He appeared distracted, a folder of documents in his hand. Seeing her, he paused. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said, stopping in the middle of the room. "I didn't expect you to talk to me," she replied with a smirk. His brow furrowed slightly, but he said nothing. Instead, he placed the folder on the table and sat in a nearby armchair. "Are you settling in?" he asked, crossing his arms. "I think so," Leah answered cautiously. "But it still feels strange, like none of this is real." Henry leaned forward slightly. "It doesn't have to feel real. This is a contract, Leah. An agreement. Everything will go exactly as planned." She studied him for a moment before tilting her head. "That's what you do, isn't it? Plan everything? Control every detail to eliminate any surprises?" He met her gaze, as if considering whether to continue the conversation. "That's how I built everything I have. Planning prevents failure," he finally said. Leah let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "You can plan all you want, but you can't control how you feel, Henry." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. Leah didn't press further. Instead, she placed the book back on the shelf and left the room, leaving Henry alone with his thoughts. Days passed, and Leah slowly adjusted to life in Henry's world. The mansion was grand, every room designed to impress. But no matter how comfortable it was, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. Everything, the lavish meals, the pristine furniture, the silent halls, felt more like a gilded cage than a home. She followed the routine, medical checkups, scheduled meals, moments of solitude. But at night, when the house was quiet, her thoughts consumed her. She had walked away from the life she once knew. Not that it had been much, but it had been hers. Now, she was carrying a child that wasn't truly hers to keep. She tried to ignore the weight of that reality. But in the stillness of the night, it was impossible to escape. While Leah wrestled with her emotions, Henry remained distant, buried in his work. Yet, no matter how much he tried to compartmentalize, he found himself thinking about her more than he intended. It was unexpected, and he didn't like surprises. It wasn't romantic or emotional, at least, not yet. But there was a growing curiosity that Henry couldn't quite explain. One afternoon, after a long day of meetings, Henry returned home and spotted Leah in the garden. She was seated on a bench, her face tilted toward the sky, eyes closed as if absorbing the warmth of the sun. The sight was different from the hardened image he had formed of her. For a brief moment, he hesitated. Then, he approached. "Enjoying the garden?" he asked in his usual firm, direct tone. Leah turned slightly, surprised to see him, but quickly regained her composure. "It's peaceful," she admitted. "Definitely better than the streets." He sat beside her, keeping a respectful distance. There was something unexpectedly disarming about her honesty. "Are you settling in?" he asked. Leah shrugged, gazing at the rows of flowers in front of her. "It still feels strange, like I'm living someone else's life." Henry was quiet for a moment before responding. "I wanted to make sure you have everything you need, so things go as planned." "As planned," she repeated, with a slight smirk. "Do you always live like this, mapping out every second of your life?" Henry raised an eyebrow, slightly taken aback. He was used to people who simply accepted his way of thinking, not those who questioned it. "Planning keeps everything running," he said firmly. "Without it, things fall apart." Leah gave a small, knowing smile and shook her head. "Not everything can be controlled, Henry. Sometimes, things just happen, whether you want them to or not." Her words unsettled him more than he expected. He stood up abruptly, signaling the conversation was over. "If you need anything, talk to Stephanie," he said, before walking back toward the house. A few days later, Henry made an unusual decision. He chose to accompany Leah to her next medical appointment. He justified it by saying he wanted to ensure everything was progressing as expected. But deep down, he felt an unfamiliar sense of responsibility. Leah didn't question it, though she was inwardly intrigued by his presence. At the doctor's office, the routine examinations took place. Then, for the first time, they heard the baby's heartbeat. Leah felt an unexpected wave of emotion wash over her. She swallowed hard, blinking back tears, trying not to show just how much that tiny sound affected her. Henry remained still, his expression unreadable. But something in his eyes had shifted, as if that simple sound had touched a part of him he wasn't prepared to acknowledge. "Everything looks perfect," the doctor said with a smile. "You can start thinking about the next steps, prenatal care, preparations for the birth?" Leah nodded, but Henry remained silent. On the drive back to the estate, the atmosphere in the car was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Henry, usually composed, seemed lost in contemplation. Leah wasn't sure what to say, so she simply stared out the window, letting the silence settle between them. When they finally arrived, Henry did something unexpected. He stepped out first and opened the car door for her. Leah hesitated for a moment before stepping out. "Thank you," she said softly, "for coming today." Henry gave a small nod, his gaze avoiding hers. "It was the least I could do," he said. "I'll make sure everything continues to go smoothly." Leah watched him walk toward the house, his posture as impeccable as ever. But something was different. Maybe the sound of the heartbeat had stirred something in him. Or maybe she was just imagining it. In the following days, Leah noticed subtle changes. Henry started appearing more often in the common areas of the house. Their conversations, though brief, became less mechanical. He asked how she was feeling, inquired about her medical appointments, and even suggested activities that might help her relax. One evening, while they sat in silence at the long dining table, Henry broke the routine. "Have you thought about what you want to do after all this?" he asked. Leah looked up, surprised. It was the first time he had shown any interest in her future. "I don't have any plans," she admitted. "I don't even know what my life will be like after this." Henry nodded, considering her response. "You'll have the resources to start over, anywhere you want. Just make sure you do something worthwhile." Leah studied him. Beneath the controlled exterior, there was something else. Something she hadn't seen before. Was it concern? She wasn't sure how to interpret it, but for the first time, she didn't feel entirely alone in the house. One morning, Leah found a package waiting at the entrance of her room. It was wrapped meticulously, a small handwritten note attached. "For your free time." Curious, she unwrapped it. Inside was a brand new sketchbook and a set of high-quality pencils. Leah was speechless. Leah had no idea that Henry knew about her love for drawing. During one of their earlier conversations, she had offhandedly mentioned how sketching had always been an escape for her, something to quiet her thoughts, a distraction from reality. She never expected him to remember, let alone act on it. That evening, while she sat outside in the garden, Henry happened to walk past. He stopped briefly and spoke casually, as if the question barely mattered. "Did you like the gift?" Leah looked up, surprised. She held the sketchbook in her lap, running her fingers over the cover. "Yes," she admitted. "Thank you. I didn't expect this." Henry merely shrugged. "It seemed like something that would be good for you." Leah smiled softly, holding the gift a little closer. "It is," she replied simply. Despite the well-planned routine of the estate, Leah found that comfort alone wasn't enough to silence the growing conflict within her. Each day felt hollow, like she was physically present but disconnected from everything happening around her. The house was beautiful. The care she received was impeccable, but something inside her remained unsettled. Meanwhile, Henry kept his usual, composed and distant demeanor. But Leah was beginning to sense there was more to him than he allowed others to see. One morning, Henry made an unexpected request. He wanted to speak with her after breakfast. It was unusual for him to initiate conversation, especially outside the structured updates Stephanie provided. Curious but wary, Leah agreed. When she entered the sitting room, Henry was already there, standing beside a neat stack of documents. "I wanted to go over a few additional details regarding the agreement," he said, matter-of-factly. Leah's stomach tightened. Was he changing the terms? "More details?" she asked cautiously. "I thought everything was already settled." Henry studied her for a moment before responding. "Nothing is changing. I just want to make sure you fully understand what will happen after the birth. I'd like to avoid any surprises." Leah exhaled slowly, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I think I understand. I leave, and you go on with your life." He gave a small nod. "Yes, but I also want you to know that if you need anything after this, regardless of our contract, I'll be available to help. I don't want you to feel abandoned." Leah raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by the offer. His tone was different, less businesslike, almost considerate. "That's unexpected," she said, unable to keep the hint of sarcasm from her voice. Henry shrugged, unfazed. "I don't like complications. This is the best way to avoid them." Leah chuckled, but as she looked at him, something about his seriousness made her pause. Maybe he was trying, just a little, to be different, even if he didn't quite know how. Later that day, Leah decided to explore the estate further. The place was enormous, filled with corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, each room adorned with expensive artwork that probably cost more than she could ever imagine. As she wandered, she stumbled upon a small study at the far end of a hallway. The door was slightly ajar. Peeking inside, she saw Henry. He was sitting at a desk, but he wasn't working. He held a framed photograph in his hands, staring at it in a way that seemed distant. Leah couldn't make out the image, but something about the way he sat, the way his fingers gripped the frame, made her hesitate. It was the first time she had seen him like this, unguarded, lost in thought. She knocked gently on the door. Henry quickly placed the photo back on the desk, his usual neutral expression returning. "Sorry," Leah said, hesitating at the doorway. "I didn't mean to interrupt." Henry looked up, clearly surprised to see her. "It's nothing," he said, his voice steady but lacking its usual authority. "Did you need something?" "No, I was just looking round," she admitted, glancing at the bookshelves that lined the walls. She hesitated before adding, "You looked like you were thinking about something important." Henry was silent for a moment before replying, "We all have things we'd rather keep to ourselves." Leah recognized a boundary when she heard one, so she shifted the conversation. "This house is huge. Do you really live here alone all the time?" He nodded, crossing his arms. It's practical. I don't like distractions. Leah studied him, trying to understand how someone could live in a place this vast, surrounded by luxury, yet seem so utterly alone. That must feel strange, she said, without much thought. Having all of this, but no one to share it with. Henry looked away, clearly uncomfortable. I'm used to it. I don't need anyone to do what I do. Leah wanted to believe him, but something in his voice told her he wasn't as certain as he claimed. Before she could say anything else, Henry stood up, signaling the conversation was over. If you need anything, Stephanie can help, he said before walking past her. That night, Leah stepped out onto the mansion's terrace. The sky was clear, the distant city lights twinkling like scattered stars. She sat quietly, letting her mind wander. She thought about the sound of the baby's heartbeat. The sound from the checkup still echoed in Leah's mind, the steady, rhythmic heartbeat that had affected her in ways she couldn't quite understand. No matter how much she tried to stay detached, something inside her was shifting. As she stood outside on the terrace, lost in thought, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Henry approaching. He looked tired, but his posture remained as rigid and composed as always. "You like this spot, don't you?" he asked as he stopped beside her. Leah glanced at the city lights stretching far beyond the estate. "I like the quiet," she admitted. "It helps me think." Henry stood beside her, gazing at the same view. Thinking isn't always a good thing. Leah let out a dry laugh, one without much humor. Try telling that to someone who spends most of their time alone. Henry didn't respond right away. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than usual. "Sometimes being surrounded by people doesn't help much either." Leah turned her head slightly, noticing something in his tone, a quiet sadness she hadn't heard before. "Maybe you need something you can't control, Henry," she said, speaking without hesitation. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to reply, but instead, he simply frowned, then turned and walked away, leaving Leah alone with her thoughts. As the days passed, Leah realized that no matter how much she tried, she couldn't keep a firm wall between herself and Henry. He remained an enigma, carefully composed and unreadable. But every so often, small cracks in his exterior revealed glimpses of something more. And despite her better judgment, a part of her wanted to understand him, to figure out the man who had brought her into this strange new life. At the same time, Henry was struggling with emotions he couldn't name. He'd entered this arrangement expecting control, simplicity, predictability. But Leah was proving that this was anything but simple, and that unsettled him. The following week, it was time for another checkup. Leah woke early, feeling a mix of nervousness and anticipation. Time was moving faster than she had expected, and soon she would get to see the baby, at least on a screen. The thought made her heart race. She wondered if Henry would come with her, as he had last time. When she came downstairs for breakfast, she spotted Stephanie going over the day's schedule with Henry. "Ready?" Henry asked, glancing up from the documents in front of him. "As ready as I'll ever be," Leah replied, trying to sound composed. "Good. We'll go together." His tone was firm, leaving no room for discussion. As they headed to the car, Leah noticed a different kind of tension in the air. Henry was as composed as ever, but there was something in his demeanor that felt off. Maybe he was nervous too, though she doubted he would ever admit it. At the doctor's office, the physician greeted them warmly and gestured for Leah to lie down while he set up the ultrasound equipment. "Today, we should get a clearer view," he explained as he adjusted the monitor. Leah shifted slightly, trying to ignore the cool gel being applied to her stomach. As the doctor moved the ultrasound wand across her skin, she held her breath, waiting. Henry stood beside her, arms crossed, his eyes locked on the screen. Then the sound came, the steady, rhythmic beating. But something was different this time. Not one heartbeat, 2. Well, here's something we didn't catch last time, the doctor said with a smile. You're expecting twins. Leah's eyes widened. Twins? She hadn't even considered that possibility. A mix of shock, joy, and an overwhelming rush of emotion hit her all at once. Instinctively, she placed a hand on her stomach, trying to absorb the reality of the news. Henry, for his part, remained silent for several seconds. His usual serious expression faltered, replaced by something Leah had never seen before. Pure, unguarded astonishment. He leaned slightly forward, staring at the screen, as if trying to process it. 2? He asked, needing confirmation. The doctor nodded. 2. Both are growing well and seem perfectly healthy. The only sound in the room after that was the rhythmic echo of the heartbeats. For Leah, it was a moment of pure wonder. And for Henry, she wasn't sure. But something in his expression told her this was changing things for both of them. No matter how hard she tried to stay detached, Leah couldn't ignore the growing connection she felt to the two lives inside her. Let's play a little game for those who only read the comments. Type pizza in the comments. Only those who make it this far will understand. Now, back to the story. Henry stood beside her, silent, yet visibly moved. His expression remained composed, but his eyes revealed something words couldn't, something raw and unspoken. For the first time, he looked vulnerable, as if the reality of becoming a father to 2 children had truly sunk in. On the drive back to the estate, the silence between them wasn't cold or distant. It felt heavier, laden with meaning. Leah finally broke the quiet. You don't seem like the type to be easily surprised, she said, trying to ease the tension. Henry exhaled, his hand steady on the wheel. I'm not, but this... He paused, carefully choosing his words. This is different. Leah glanced at him, intrigued. Henry was rarely expressive, yet now he seemed lost in thought. Does it scare you? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned slightly, meeting her gaze for a brief moment before answering. It amazes me, knowing that in just a few months, 2 completely new lives will be here, depending on me. Leah felt a pang deep in her chest. She knew she would have to let them go when the time came. But hearing Henry talk about them with such care only made her realize how much she was already attached to them. They also depend on me, she said softly. At least for now. Henry nodded. I know. That's why I want to make sure you're okay, Leah. Not just physically, but in every way. That matters to me. She remained quiet, absorbing his words. It was the first time he had spoken so openly about what they were going through together. Later that night, Leah stood on the terrace, staring at the distant city lights. She heard footsteps behind her, and moments later, Henry joined her. He hesitated, a rare occurrence, before speaking. I can't stop thinking about what the doctor said today, he admitted, taking a seat beside her. 2 babies, 2 futures. Leah turned to him, surprised by his openness. It's a lot of responsibility, she said. Henry exhaled, his gaze fixed on the skyline. It's more than that. This is the first time I've felt like something in my life isn't predictable. I can't plan who these 2 will become. I can't control the people they'll grow into. Leah shivered slightly, not just from the cold, but from the realization that Henry was admitting something she never thought he would, that some things in life were beyond his control. You know, she said gently, sometimes that's a good thing. Not knowing what's next can bring things you never imagined. Henry turned his head slightly, as if considering her words. For the first time, he seemed to accept the idea that not everything could be planned. The discovery of the twins brought an unexpected lightness to the estate. Stephanie took it upon herself to adjust the nursery, making space for 2 instead of 1. Leah watched as the once empty room transformed into something warm, something real. She tried to remind herself that this wasn't her future, that she had agreed to leave when it was over. but deep down, she knew it wouldn't be as easy as she had once believed. As preparations continued, Leah and Henry began to realize that the contract that had brought them together was evolving into something far more complicated. The twins, who had yet to be born, were already reshaping both of their lives in ways neither had expected. The days following the revelation of the twins brought subtle, yet significant changes between Leah and Henry. Though he remained reserved and methodical, small gestures hinted at something different. One afternoon, after a routine medical checkup, Henry did something unexpected. He walked her to the car himself. Normally, he would have left such tasks to Stephanie or another staff member. "Are you feeling okay?" he asked, as he held the car door open for her. Leah blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Yes, I'm fine," she said. "Thank you." On the drive back, their usual silence was broken by an unusual question. "Is there anything you need?" Henry asked. "Something that might make you more comfortable?" Leah studied him, trying to decipher his expression. His question didn't feel like a casual courtesy. There was something more genuine behind it. "Nothing comes to mind right now," she admitted. "But thank you for asking." Henry nodded, returning his focus to the road. Leah could feel it. Something was shifting. Despite his insistence on keeping things transactional, Henry seemed to genuinely care about her well-being. Back at the estate, more subtle changes appeared. One evening, Leah returned to her room to find a set of new pillows and blankets neatly arranged on her bed. A small note lay on top. "To help you rest better." Leah smiled to herself. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. Later that night, she sat in the living room, sipping tea. Henry walked in and, without a word, took a seat across from her. For the first time, he looked at ease. "Did you like what I left in your room?" he asked bluntly. Leah nodded. "Yes, it was thoughtful of you." "Good," he said simply. "I want to make sure you're comfortable. That's important to me." Leah frowned slightly. She appreciated the gesture, but there was still a lingering hesitation, a barrier of uncertainty between them. "You're changing, Henry," she said, meeting his gaze. "Or at least, it seems that way, but I still don't know why." He held her stare for a long moment, as if debating how to respond. Finally, he sighed. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I am changing." He paused before adding, "But the truth is, I don't know how to be different." He looked away, his expression unreadable. "I'm not used to caring." His words caught Leah off guard. For a man who controlled every aspect of his life, admitting something like that was unexpected. And for the first time, she realized Henry wasn't just changing. He was struggling with it. For so long, Henry had kept parts of himself locked away. But there he was, revealing a side of himself that Leah never expected to see. That night, as she sat on the terrace looking up at the stars, she replayed their conversation in her mind. Henry wasn't at all what she had imagined when this arrangement began. He was still difficult to figure out, rigid, guarded. But beneath the calculated exterior, there was something undeniably human. She just didn't know whether that was a good or bad thing. Meanwhile, in his office, Henry sat at his desk, staring at the contract that had defined everything between them. For the first time, the weight of that document felt heavy. He had started this with a simple goal: secure an heir and move forward. But now, things weren't so clear-cut. He was starting to care, and that terrified him. The next morning, Henry did something unusual. He joined Leah for breakfast. "There's something I want to talk to you about," he said, breaking the quiet. Leah looked up, intrigued. "What is it?" He hesitated for a moment, something he rarely did. Then, with surprising honesty, he said, "I know you still don't trust me, and I can't blame you. I've never been good at trusting people, and it's made me someone who isn't always easy to deal with. Leah stayed silent, sensing that he wasn't finished. I've spent years believing I couldn't rely on anyone, that keeping my distance was the only way to avoid disappointment, he continued. But with you, I'm starting to wonder if I was wrong. She blinked, surprised at his admission. It was rare to hear Henry talk about himself, especially in such a vulnerable way. We all have walls, Henry, she said softly, but that doesn't mean we have to stay hidden behind them forever. He nodded slightly, as if considering her words. Maybe, but change isn't easy for me. Leah offered a small smile. No one said it would be. Later that day, Henry surprised her again. He asked if she wanted to go for a walk in the garden. At first, their conversation was light, focusing on everyday things, but eventually, it turned back to the babies. Have you thought about names? Henry asked, catching her off guard. No, not yet, she admitted. I thought that was something you'd want to decide on your own. I think it would be fair to do it together, he said simply. Leah was taken aback. Henry was trying, not just to be involved, but to be present. She still wasn't sure how much she could trust it, but she couldn't deny that something in him was shifting. As the sun began to set, they sat on a bench, watching the sky turn shades of gold and pink. I never imagined myself here, doing this, Leah murmured, almost to herself. Neither did I, Henry admitted. Then, after a pause, he added, but maybe this is exactly where we're meant to be. Leah looked at him, noticing the way his guard had softened, just a little. Maybe, just maybe, this was becoming more than just a contract. The morning started like any other. Leah, now heavily pregnant, felt the weight of the months in every movement, but she pushed forward, determined to keep to her routine. Henry, as usual, was in his office, buried in work. Their interactions, though still measured, had become a quiet source of comfort for both of them. But something was different that day. Just before lunch, Leah felt a sudden, sharp pain. At first, she dismissed it as another common discomfort, something she could push through. But when the pain intensified, a wave of realization hit her. This wasn't normal. Alarmed, she called for Stephanie, who immediately noticed the severity of the situation. We need to tell Henry, Stephanie said, helping Leah to sit. This could be the start of labor. Leah nodded, trying to steady her breathing as another wave of pain struck her. Minutes later, Henry appeared in the room. His usual composed expression faltered for the first time. Leah, he said quickly, moving toward her. What's happening? She met his gaze, her voice strained. I think it's happening. The babies are coming. For a brief moment, Henry seemed frozen. But then, just as quickly, he snapped into action. He grabbed his phone, instructing the driver to get the car ready and ordering Stephanie to pack everything they needed for the hospital. We're leaving now, he said, his voice firm but carrying an urgency Leah had never heard from him before. The drive to the hospital was a blur of emotions. Leah focused on controlling her breathing, gripping the seat as the contractions came faster. Henry sat beside her, tense, his usual confidence edged with something unfamiliar, worry. Then, without hesitation, he reached for her hand. It was instinctive, almost absent-minded, but his grip was steady, grounding. We're almost there, he said, his voice quieter this time. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze. You'll be okay. For the first time since this arrangement had begun, Leah truly believed him. Henry gently squeezed her hand. We'll be okay, he said, softly. Leah didn't respond, but something about his words gave her an unexpected sense of calm. At the hospital, everything moved fast. A medical team was already waiting, thanks to Henry's meticulous planning, and Leah was quickly taken to the delivery room. Henry stayed beside her the entire time. Even when the nurses tried to usher him out, he remained firm. I'm not leaving, he said, gripping Leah's hand. I'm staying right here. The next few hours were a blur of pain, exhaustion, and overwhelming emotion. Henry had never witnessed anything like it before. He saw Leah's strength as she brought the twins into the world, moment by moment, breath by breath. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, yet in a single instant, everything changed. A small but powerful cry filled the room. "It's a boy," the doctor announced with a smile. "A strong, healthy boy." Henry felt his chest tighten as he watched the newborn being carefully placed on a nearby table. Before he could fully process what was happening, another cry rang through the room. A second. "A girl," the doctor confirmed. Leah, exhausted but with eyes shining, turned to look at her newborns as the nurses gently cleaned and wrapped them in soft blankets. She longed to hold them. She knew the moment would be fleeting, but nothing could prepare her for how much she already loved them. Henry stood frozen for a moment, watching in silence. Then, as if something inside him had finally shifted, he stepped closer. He took Leah's hand in his own. His voice was rough, filled with an emotion he didn't quite understand. "You were incredible," he said. "Thank you." Tears streamed down Leah's face. She didn't know if they were from joy, relief, or the heartbreaking reality that soon she would have to let them go. Moments later, the babies were placed in her arms. Leah held them carefully, feeling their warmth, their fragility. She traced every detail, their closed eyes, their tiny fingers twitching as if searching for something familiar. An overwhelming love washed over her. She knew without a doubt that no matter what happened next, she would carry a part of them forever. Henry remained by her side, silently watching. When he finally reached out to hold the boy, his usually hard expression softened in a way Leah had never seen before. For him, this had never just been about securing an heir. Now, holding his son, he realized this was life in its purest form. A connection he had never experienced before. When he held the girl, he closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if trying to memorize every detail, to etch the feeling into his soul. Then he turned to Leah. She saw something in his gaze she never expected. Gratitude. "They're perfect," he murmured, his voice raw with emotion. Leah, still holding their son, could only nod. Tears streamed freely down her face, but for the first time, she didn't try to stop them. That night, as Leah rested in her hospital room, Henry remained in the observation area, watching over the twins as they slept. He had never felt this way before. For the first time, he realized these children weren't just a plan. They weren't a contract. They weren't an obligation. They were his. They were his family. Stephanie arrived carrying a cup of coffee. She placed it on the nearby table, watching him carefully. "Mr. Lawson," she said gently, "is everything all right?" Henry hesitated. He wasn't sure how to put what he felt into words. Finally, he exhaled, his voice quieter than usual. "For the first time in a long while," he admitted, "I think it is." Stephanie smiled and stepped away, leaving him alone with his thoughts and with his children. Meanwhile, in her room, Leah woke up to an overwhelming sense of emptiness. She had never felt so much love, yet never felt so alone. As much as she wanted to hold on to the happiness of this moment, she couldn't forget the reality. The contract still loomed over them. The babies, her babies, wouldn't be hers for much longer. She swallowed the pain, trying to prepare herself for what was to come. Then, the door opened. Henry stepped inside. In his arms, he carried both twins. Leah's breath caught in her throat. There was something different about him now. Something had changed, not just in his relationship with the babies, but in the way he looked at her. He walked over, gently placing their son into Leah's arms before sitting beside her with their daughter. "I don't know how," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper, "but this has changed everything." Leah held the baby close, her heart aching. She nodded, knowing that no matter what happened next, this moment, this miracle, was something she would never forget. Months later, the mansion was quiet. Too quiet. Leah knew what today meant. The weeks following the twins' birth had been filled with indescribable joy, but also with anguish. She had loved them more than she thought was possible, but the contract had been clear. Her time there was coming to an end. Today, she was supposed to walk away. Packing her few belongings into a small suitcase, she glanced at the cribs where the babies still slept peacefully. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she forced herself not to cry. She didn't want her final memory to be one of weakness. Leah knew what she had agreed to. She reminded herself of that over and over, trying to convince herself she was doing the right thing. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Stephanie entered, her expression filled with quiet concern. "Is everything ready?" she asked gently. Leah swallowed hard, forcing herself to nod. "Yes. Thank you for everything, Stephanie." The assistant hesitated, her eyes studying Leah carefully. "Are you sure this is what you want?" she asked. "It seems like there's something more between you and Mr. Lawson?" Leah forced a small smile, though her heart felt heavier than ever. "It's not about what I want," she said, quietly. "It's about what was agreed upon." Stephanie didn't push further. She simply nodded and promised to let Henry know that Leah was ready to leave. When Leah descended the grand staircase with her suitcase in hand, she found Henry waiting in the foyer. He stood by the front door, his gaze fixed on her. The man standing there wasn't the cold, calculating businessman she had met months ago. There was something different about him now, something raw, something vulnerable, as if he was on the verge of losing something irreplaceable. Leah broke the silence. "Everything's ready." Henry didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his eyes locked onto hers. "Are you really leaving?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost strained. A lump formed in Leah's throat, but she forced herself to stand firm. "That was the deal," she said. "I did my part. Now, it's time to move on." Henry stood still for a long moment. Then, without a word, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the contract, the very document that had dictated everything between them. He held it between his fingers, looking down at it as if it no longer meant anything. "This contract," he said, his voice steady now, "should never have defined what's happening between us." Before Leah could respond, he tore the paper in half. Then again and again. The torn pieces fluttered to the floor, the sound echoing through the room like a final declaration. "I don't want you to go, Leah," Henry said, stepping closer. "I don't want this to end." Leah's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the scattered remains of the contract, her heart pounding, but fear held her back. "Henry, you can't just tear up a contract and expect everything to change," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not that simple." He took another step toward her, his eyes full of something she had never seen before. Raw emotion. "I know it's not simple," he admitted. "Nothing about this has been simple for me, but these past few months have shown me something I never had the courage to admit." He took a deep breath. "I need you, Leah. Not just because of the twins, but because you brought something into my life that I didn't even know was missing." His words hit her like a wave, but she shook her head, trying to hold on to her defenses. "And how do I know this is real?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How do I trust that you won't change your mind? That you won't pull away when things get hard?" Henry exhaled, running a hand through his hair as if struggling with his own emotions. "Because I've already tried living without feeling anything for anyone," he said, "and it left me empty." He stepped even closer, his voice quieter now. "You showed me that I don't have to be afraid of caring, of being human, and yes, it scares me. But what scares me more is losing this. Losing you." Tears welled in Leah's eyes. She wanted to believe him, but the wounds of her past held her back. "I fell in love with you, Henry," she confessed, her voice breaking. "But you don't understand how hard it is for me to trust. I've spent my whole life being discarded, ignored. How do I believe you won't do the same?" Henry moved even closer, so near she could feel his warmth. "Because you changed everything for me," he said, his voice full of conviction. "And I'm not the kind of man who says that lightly." His hands reached for hers, holding them tightly. "I don't know how to prove it to you, Leah, but I'm willing to try. Every day, for the rest of my life, if you'll let me." His words broke through her defenses. Leah felt the last of her resistance crumbling. She had spent so long preparing to walk away. But what if she didn't have to? "What if this doesn't work?" she whispered, afraid of the answer. Henry met her gaze without hesitation. "Then we'll try again," he said. "And again. And again, if we have to. But I won't give up on you, Leah. Not ever." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Leah felt her doubts begin to fade, replaced by something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. She looked at Henry and realized he was willing to let go of control, to open himself up, to fight for her. Finally, she nodded, letting the tears fall freely. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll stay." Henry let out a deep breath, relief washing over his face. Without another word, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. For the first time, Leah felt certain. This was where she was meant to be. The sun rose over the estate, painting the sky in soft hues of gold and pink. Leah woke to the quiet sounds of the twins stirring in the next room. She lay still for a moment, realizing something was different. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't waking up to uncertainty. She wasn't waking up to fear. She had made her choice, and for the first time, she knew it was the right one. Henry had made his choice. He had opened his heart, allowing them to build something real, something neither of them had expected. Leah got up and walked to the nursery, where the twins were already awake, making soft, cooing sounds as they stretched in their cribs. She leaned over, gently stroking their rosy cheeks, whispering words of love and comfort. Before she could lose herself in the moment, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Henry standing in the doorway, watching with a quiet smile. His eyes, once guarded and distant, now held a warmth she could only describe as love. "Good morning," he said, as he stepped into the room and moved toward the twins. "Good morning," Leah replied. Henry picked up their son, cradling him carefully. He gazed down at the baby with an expression of wonder, as if still in awe of the life they had created. "I never imagined this would feel so natural," he admitted, almost to himself. Leah smiled, watching as he embraced his role as a father. There was something deeply fulfilling about seeing him so devoted to the twins. In the weeks that followed, life was an adjustment. Henry, though inexperienced, put effort into learning how to care for the babies. He changed diapers, though clumsily at first, fed them, and even attempted to sing lullabies, despite his deep voice being far from melodic. For Leah, his dedication was proof of something undeniable. He was changing. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, with the twins sleeping peacefully nearby, Henry turned to her, his expression serious yet calm. "I've been thinking about something," he said. Leah glanced at him, curious. "What is it?" He took a deep breath before speaking. "I want us to be a real family, not just because of the twins, because I want you by my side, always." Leah's heart pounded. She had felt their connection grow, but she hadn't expected him to say it so plainly. "Henry, this is a big step," she said, trying to process his words. "Are you sure?" He reached for her hands, holding them firmly as he looked into her eyes. "I've never been more sure of anything," he said. I know I made mistakes in the beginning, but I don't want to build our life on contracts or obligations. I want to build it on love." His sincerity was undeniable. Tears welled in Leah's eyes as she nodded. "I want that too, Henry. Let's try." A few weeks later, an intimate ceremony was held in the garden of the estate. Only close friends and staff, who had become like family, were invited, including Stephanie, who had been there through it all. The day was perfect. Sunlight filtering through the trees, a soft breeze carrying the scent of flowers. Leah wore a simple yet elegant dress, and Henry looked sharp in his tailored suit. The twins, dressed adorably, were nestled in Stephanie's arms as she wiped away tears of joy. When Henry and Leah exchanged vows, they spoke from the heart. Henry promised to be the man she deserved, to always stand by her no matter what. Leah, in turn, vowed to trust him, to help him continue becoming the best version of himself. As they stood together, holding their babies in their arms, Stephanie smiled through her tears. "You make a beautiful family," she said. And she was right. For the first time, Henry, Leah, and the twins were exactly where they were meant to be. After the ceremony, life continued with its challenges, but also with joy. Together, they built a home filled with love and laughter. They learned to be parents, navigating sleepless nights and endless feedings, balancing exhaustion with happiness. One night, as Leah put the twins to bed, Henry appeared at the doorway. Without a word, he walked over and wrapped her in a tight embrace. Leah rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the sound that had become her greatest comfort. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he whispered. She smiled, closing her eyes. "Thank you for showing me I could trust again." Months later, on a warm afternoon, Henry and Leah sat in the garden, watching the twins play on a soft blanket in the grass. Their laughter filled the air, pure and joyful. Leah turned to Henry, watching him as he smiled at their children. "Are you happy?" she asked. He looked at her, then at the twins, before answering. "I never thought I could be this happy," he admitted. "You've given me more than I ever knew I needed. A family, a purpose, love." Leah smiled, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. "And you've shown me that love can be built, even through struggles. Thank you for that." As they leaned in for a gentle kiss, the twins babbled something that sounded like "Mama" and "Dada." Henry and Leah laughed, overwhelmed with emotion. They leaned closer to their children, wrapping them in all the love they had to give. That moment, simple, perfect, was proof of everything they had fought for. Life wasn't perfect, but it was filled with love, understanding, and hope. And that was all they needed to move forward. What did you think of Henry's decision? Share your thoughts in the comments. Rate this story from 1 to 10, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated with all our stories. And don't forget to check out more touching stories by clicking here on the end screen.